these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
All right, welcome back, folks. Look, I like to talk oil and gas. I am from Houston, after all, and so figure why not have the chief executive of the American Petroleum Institute on the podcast, Mike Sommers. Mike, thanks for being on.
Dan, great to be with you. Thanks so much for the invitation.
So API is the largest national trade association, represents all aspects of America's natural gas and oil industry. It's a hot topic these days. People are concerned about energy independence, their electricity prices, their gas prices. And, fundamentally, people want to know why that's the case. You got a lot of experience in politics, of course. You were a Speaker of the House, John Boehner's chief of staff. So I bet you got some fun stories. You were a special assistant to President George W. Bush, the National Economic Council. So, you've been around and also watched the revolution of oil and gas over the past couple of decades. So this will be a fun conversation, for people who are concerned about important things. I don't know about fun, but again, thanks for being on. Where do we begin? Maybe let's begin with what's probably top of mind for people. Why are gas prices high? I mean, from an economic standpoint, from a policy standpoint, why? What is going on?
Yeah. Well, let's start with the global pandemic that we just went through. So if you put it in broad terms, the world consumes about 100 million barrels of oil every single day. And what that means is that we have to provide that oil to the world consumers. And the real question is whether world consumers are going to get that oil from the United States, which produces it in the most environmentally responsible way, and in a stable government that promotes democracy all over the world, or from countries that are more hostile to American interests. So 100 million barrels every single day. During the pandemic, in the worst part of the pandemic, the world started consuming only about 81 million barrels of oil every single day. But let's put that in perspective, right? All global economies were basically shut down during that terrible period, the worst part of the pandemic, and the world was still consuming 81 million barrels of oil every single day. So I think that's an indication, first of all, that this industry is not going anywhere anytime soon. And it's important that American energy leadership continues. So that's just in broad strokes what the world consumes and how the United States can continue to help fill the need, because the United States fills about 20 million of those barrels every single day. So the first thing to remember is that because of that global pandemic, the world stopped producing as much oil. And so it's taken a while for markets to get back to where they need to be. Today, we're consuming about 97 million barrels of oil every single day, but that also is at a period where people are still not going to work or going to school at quite the levels of where they need to be. So one of the reasons is the pandemic, and supply just hasn't quite gotten to where it needs to be. But I think a more important reason and more interesting from a Washington policy perspective is we currently have an administration that is pursuing policies that seek to undermine American energy leadership, not advance American energy leadership. So this administration started on day one by canceling the Keystone XL pipeline. On day three, they put a pause on new leasing and permitting on federal lands and in federal waters. They canceled exploration of the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. And it seems like every single day, there's a new policy that seeks to undermine American energy leadership. So that's, I think, very much has a lot to do with why prices are where they are today.
Right. So basically, an increase in demand, a rapid maybe resurgence in demand. Is there more demand for energy now than pre-pandemic? Do we have a way of measuring that or knowing that?
Well, the only way that we can do it generally is based on what we see demand on a daily basis. So we're almost back to that $100 million or 100 million barrel benchmark. So that's the way we generally judge it here at the American Petroleum Institute. But you certainly are seeing that demand come back. Another interesting statistic. So we're almost back at 100 million. And there's about 3 million of aviation fuel, 3 million barrels of aviation fuel that aren't back to where they were pre-pandemic. So I would anticipate that we're going to get back up to that level as the world starts traveling again and people start going back to work. So we're going to be using more oil, I suspect, post-pandemic than we were pre-pandemic. And that's true on the natural gas side as well.
Could we go over like a kind of a list of things the Biden administration has done to chill that investment into new production? So, I mean, fundamentally, supply isn't keeping up with demand. Okay, so that's a simple way of saying everything that you said, right? But there's a reason for that, and Biden wants to blame the oil and gas industry, right? He says they're deliberately not producing, they're deliberately price gouging, they're doing all of these things. Now, that does sound a little bit like OPEC. But it doesn't quite. I don't think that, because I mean that's literally what they do, right? They prefer a certain price, and they will limit production to keep it at that price. I mean, they're actually very transparent about this. This isn't a secret. But does that really apply to American oil and gas?
Well, let's think about actually what the Biden administration has done. So they're literally begging OPEC to pump more oil to reduce gas prices. The irony of them asking a price gouging regime while at the same time accusing the American oil and gas industry of price gouging I think is thick, and it hasn't been lost on American consumers. It is very clear that American consumers want to get more oil and gas from the United States, not from OPEC and not from Russia. I think what they should be doing is encouraging more American production. And the first thing they could do is reverse some of those key policies, whether it's the Keystone XL pipeline or the ban on permitting and leasing or getting us back up in ANWR. But there have been other things that they've done. They've authorized a new FTC, a Federal Trade Commission investigation into price gouging. This would be the 30th one of those that the FTC has done, never to find any collusion. They started doing this in 1929. This is just what politicians do when gas prices are high. But the other thing they're talking about now, which is really scary, is a real discussion about whether to reimpose the oil export ban in the United States. So one of the key accomplishments actually of the Biden administration was lifting the ban on crude oil exports from the United States. It's easy to say from a demagogic perspective that that would lower gas prices in the United States. In fact, the exact opposite is true. Gas prices would go up if you reimposed the oil export ban that was in place as a consequence of policies put in place by Jimmy Carter. So it's not just what they have done, it's also what they're talking about doing, which is why we're trying to stress the importance of growing American energy leadership, not putting a damper on it, which is what this administration has done on purpose.
Yeah, and are you seeing that production companies are just having a hard time getting investments into new drilling sites, into new leases? I mean, they've made it harder to get leases. They've made it harder to permit new pipelines. So it's hard to imagine investors feel very safe investing in the oil and gas sector either.
Yeah, I mean, we have to put, we have to keep in mind also that, most of our API member companies don't have trouble accessing capital yet. But that certainly is a threat ongoing in the future. So if you're an investor now and you're looking at this policy scenario that has been designed on purpose by the Biden administration to limit American production, you're wondering what the long-term prospects are for American energy leadership. I think there's going to be more regulations coming out of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The Biden administration has taken this whole of government approach on tackling climate change. And I do think long term there is real concern about investment within the industry. And by the way, we're already underinvesting in not just in the United States, but throughout the world to meet future demand.
And another way to talk about investment, not just capital inflowing into the companies, but what those companies are willing to do with it. Are they willing to take that big bet and spend billions of dollars doing the necessary surveying, et cetera, to see if there's oil somewhere when, in the Build Back Better plan, for instance, there's all these potential pitfalls, increases in royalty fees, increases in leasing fees. It's just everything. I mean, they just kind of nickel and dime on a variety of things. We can go over that in detail. I'm not sure listeners care about the details, but just know that it would make it much more costly and difficult to do business. And so why put the investment now into that future business? I mean, how long does it take to, from start to finish, from deciding to explore something to actually extracting oil and gas out of it?
Yeah, I mean, and that's the real concern. You've really hit the nail on the head, that the investment's not there because of concerns about what future government policies are going to be. And I will say there's also been a renewed focus on making sure that investors are getting the bang for the buck in terms of investing into the industry. But, it depends on the kind of project. But if you think about the fact, a lot of American production still comes from the Gulf of Mexico. It takes decades to get those kinds of projects online. And it takes a lot of capital, of course, to figure out where the resource is, do all the seismicity testing, and all the environmental protection that we put in place. But you think about it takes a decade sometimes to get those projects up and going. But then they produce for decades on end, 2 decades, 3 decades out into the future. It's a little bit different, of course, when you're in the Permian Basin, for example, where the regulatory scheme is a lot better and they're more short cycle projects. I do think the long cycle projects are where we're not seeing that development. So really, amazingly, there's only one major long cycle project going on right now in the world, and that's the project offshore in Guyana. Where they're continuing to explore. They've found huge resources there, and it's a joint project by ExxonMobil and Hess. But there's no other mega projects that are under consideration right now. And I do think it's because of this just lack of certainty about what the future holds. But here's the problem, that the International Energy Agency suggests that we need $500 billion of investment every single year for the next decade to keep up with current demand and future demand. So the challenge right now is that we're way below that as an industry. In fact, there was a study that was released just this week that suggests that number is at about $300 billion for 2021. So in the future, what that means is a real more pronounced energy shocks. We're not going to be able to provide the affordable, reliable energy that the world has come to depend on. And that's a real concern. Policymakers should be pushing the industry to invest more and encouraging this kind of investments in long cycle mega projects. But most regulators, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, have really tried to shy away from these kinds of investments. And that's going to mean major consequences for world consumers not just this year, but deep into the future.
Yeah, because as you said, normal demand's about 100 million barrels a day. What does that look like in 20 years?
Yeah, well, we can't make those kinds of projections, but I suspect let's just use one example. So when the world really started to transition from using coal to using oil and gas, that was in the 1960s, right? That's when oil and gas really became the dominant energy source in the world. So 1960s is when we started to turn away from coal. But at the same time, the world today consumes 3 times more coal than it did in the 1960s. So this is something that's been suggested by a number of different energy economists, most recently by the great Dan Yergin, who is probably the best energy analyst in the world. Most of the time, these so-called energy transitions are not transitions at all. They're additions. They're adding new sources of energy to meet future energy needs. So the world's gonna have 2 billion more people in 2010 than we have today, and IEA suggests that we're going to be using 50% more energy in 2050 than we are now. So where's that energy going to come from? It's going to come from oil and gas, which IEA suggests is still going to be 50% of the energy mix, even if every country in the world meets its Paris climate commitments, which we know is unlikely to happen. So it's going to come from oil and gas. It's going to continue to come from coal. It's also going to come from increasingly from renewables. And that's not a bad thing, because we need to make sure that all resources are there to provide the energy needs that the world's going to require going forward.
Yeah. And, you mentioned before, you got to get the oil and gas from somewhere. We can pretend in this fantasy world where we're going to transition away from this, but it's not likely anytime soon. Well, it's impossible anytime soon. It's not that, just that it's unlikely. And so you might as well get it from American oil and gas. But how do you convince somebody that American oil companies operate at a higher environmental standard than everybody else? Do we have specifics? Is there something that we can? I can show people statistics about the life cycle of natural gas production, Russia versus the U.S. 42% higher emissions from Russian natural gas. What else can we tell people to convince them that of this truth?
Yeah, look, and I think we have a tendency to talk about big numbers. You mentioned one of them, but the truth of the matter is, we need to show people. I'm a show it, don't tell it. One of the great parts about my job is that I get to visit these facilities all over the world. And I can tell you, the American oil and gas industry is focused on limiting its environmental footprint. Every single year, we're improving that environmental footprint. We're focused on reducing methane emissions in particular. Every single company that's an API member has a commitment now to continue to reduce methane. We have programs internal to API, which encourages reducing methane emissions. And I'll remind everyone that the United States, our greenhouse gas emissions continue to go down while China's continue to go up. I think the record is clear as to who produces this in the most clean and environmentally safe way, and we want to continue to do that here. Just a little thought experiment, though. Earlier this week, President Biden had a call with Vladimir Putin about the situation going on in Ukraine. Let's think about what that conversation would have been like if the United States wasn't producing almost 20 million barrels of oil every single day. That would be a completely different conversation. And I'll remind you that 10 years ago, the United States was only producing 5 million barrels of oil every single day, and that number was going down. And then the fracking revolution happened, and we became the world's largest energy producer. Think about the lack of leverage that President Biden would have on that key issue of Ukraine if we were only producing 5 million barrels of oil every single day. That's a completely different conversation. And it's really scary that we would want to limit that production now at a time when the world is a more dangerous place, and we're going to need energy to make sure that we can meet the needs of world consumers.
Yeah, it's hard to educate people on this. It shouldn't be hard. Bloomberg reported in October that coal use in the United States has increased for the first time since 2013 by like 20-something%. This is the same in Germany. Germany's emissions have gone up 25% this year from electricity, in particular, because of this transition to coal. And people are like, we don't get it. What's going on? I thought we were winning the battle. And no, it's because when you attack fossil fuels, oil and gas, you raise the prices for those fossil fuels for the reasons that we've just stated. And then countries have to transition to coal because relying on wind and solar it's a fantasy. It's just a fantasy. Can it be part of the energy mix? Sure. Should you be transitioning to nuclear if you're going to invest in anything? Yes, obviously. But they don't like nuclear because they watch The Simpsons and Chernobyl. I don't know. But it's nonsense. The point I'm making, I think, is left-wing environmentalism tends to increase emissions every single time. One other, I want to ask you about Joe Biden's valiant attempt to lower gas prices by releasing some of the strategic reserve and in coordination with some other countries that also released some strategic reserve. Give us an idea of how much oil that really was and how much it affected gas prices.
So, let's go back to where we started. 100 million barrels every single day. They're releasing 50 million barrels out of the SPR. So 1/2 of one day's demand is what was least. We don't have any objection to them, doing that. The SPR, of course, is not meant to modulate prices. It's meant for times of national crisis. What they really should be doing is encouraging American production to get back to where it was, not limiting and imposing new policies that are going to harm American production. So
Right.
it's a Band-Aid approach, and it isn't going to be near what is needed to get gas prices to where they are or where they need to be from a sustainable level.
Well, there was that hilarious press release from the White House. The DCCC, I think, released it. There was this graph of gas prices decreasing by 2 cents, and they're like, "Thanks, Joe Biden," and then everybody just zooms out and see it's just, it's completely absurd. I posted it on social media. I think everybody listening probably saw this because everybody ridiculed it. It was completely ridiculous because you zoom out from 2 weeks to 6 months, and they chose this tiny little window to show that gas prices went down 2 cents after going up many dollars.
Well, one of the charts that we often use to really demonstrate the American energy revolution that's occurred in the last decade is we've charted what has happened to other household costs aside from energy. So, of course, education has gone up significantly. Healthcare has gone up, almost 60% in the last decade. Housing costs have gone up almost a third. But over the pre-2021, household energy costs have gone down 14% in the last decade. That is only because of American oil and gas production in the United States. So imagine the economic situation that we would have been dealing with 10 years over the course of the last decade if it weren't for household energy costs going down 14%, and it just gone up on average of what everything else has gone up. So we need to get back to that. We need to get back to providing affordable and reliable energy that American consumers have come to expect.
Is it just energy, from petroleum products? What else is made from petroleum products?
Well, of course, that's the other key factor. Everything in your life is made from petroleum products. I look at your office and, all of the things that are around there, like obviously the resources in the technology we use, the plastics, even some medicines are petroleum based. 20% of electric cars are petroleum based. So it really is the basis for our entire modern life. And the idea that you would want to limit that kind of production that has provided so much to the world. In fact, I often argue, Congressman, that this is an industry that has done more to advance our humanity than just about any other industry in the world. We should be promoting this industry. We should be singing it from the high hilltops about what this industry has done to advance humanity. And I'm proud to work in it because it has done so much for the world. And it will continue to be a key part of economic development for decades and decades and decades to come.
So one thing I talk about a lot, speaking of messaging for the industry, is sometimes the industry gets in its own way in this regard. And I think, in my opinion, messages too much on transitioning, right? Especially the bigger oil companies. They want to message about transitioning to the next energy revolution. I know that's good for PR. I would prefer if everybody just started talking about why what they do is important and just talking about the truth. I mean, we've hit a lot of irrefutable facts in this short conversation. That's what we should be talking about. I shared a video. It was a commercial played by, I can't remember it was because it was a smaller company. It was a smaller mid-sized company that put all this effort into this commercial that talked about how your life would change if you didn't have oil and gas. And it was it was a well done commercial. It was just a few people living their lives and things just disappearing. And because people don't know that the components of your cell phone, the clothing you wear, if it's in synthetic materials, I mean, all of these things, they just disappear without the oil and gas industry. That's the kind of messaging that people need to know, because look, not everybody has time to listen to this podcast. Not everyone has time to research every policy detail. A lot of people operate on emotions and feelings, and And so, look, they don't know these things, and they need to be told these things. And sometimes it has to be marketed in a proper way. How do I convince the industry of this for the most part?
Well, look, I mean, I do think, the industry has a great story to tell. We want to advance that story. We do know that the world's going to need more energy going forward, and it's going to come from a lot of different sources. And we're interested in continuing to advance humanity through the oil and gas industry. And I know the industry is committed to that. So it's
You're giving me a very political answer. It's fine. It's fine. This is not a political podcast, contrary to popular belief. This is real talk.
Podcast,
yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. But fair enough. I know. I get it. But you've heard what I have to say about it, and that's what matters.
Absolutely. And look, and I love that commercial too. They did a really good job of really laying this out. Look, and I'd encourage all of your listeners to check out some of the content that API has put up. You can learn more about what we do at api.org. And learn more about how we're addressing the climate challenge as well.
So another policy we might disagree on with the API is the carbon tax. And so, but let's first talk about the difference between what is being proposed by the Biden administration and then the Build Back Better plan, which is a methane fee versus a carbon fee. People probably think they're the same thing, but let's talk about why they're different. What exactly is in the Build Back Better plan, and why that in particular is so detrimental?
Yeah. So, first of all, let's start with that methane fee. So we have great objections to what they're putting forward. We call it a natural gas tax. And at a time of high gas prices right now, natural gas prices, which we use to electrify and to heat homes, we don't think it's the right policy to put a tax on natural gas, which is just going to increase prices for American consumers. I do think that there is a very important distinction between a price on carbon or CO2 and a price on methane. And here's the reason. Methane is natural gas. It is something that we use. It is our product. It is in our financial best interest to keep that product in the pipes so that we can get it to American consumers. So we don't think that it should be regulated. We support a regulatory approach here, but making it more expensive for American consumers at a time of high energy prices is the exact opposite thing that we should do. So we are working very hard to get that new natural gas tax out of the Senate bill because it was in the House bill, unfortunately. Even though it was modified, we don't think it's the wise policy choice here. Generally on climate change, API in March advanced a new policy called our Climate Action Framework, which you can find at api.org/climate. It does endorse an economy-wide price on carbon, not necessarily a carbon tax. But the idea here is that we're not just going to support a carbon tax that would fund new government programs. What we're talking about here is a price on carbon that would replace existing regulatory regimes. And I'll remind everyone on this podcast that there already is an implicit price on carbon in almost every regulation that this industry deals with. So what we're talking about is eliminating all of those implicit costs and making it an explicit price, which makes it more economic to invest in new technologies to address the risks of climate change. So this isn't just some tax that we're going to endorse that can fund some new government program. It's about replacing underlying and existing regulations to make this more transparent to American consumers.
Yeah, fair enough. That's a pretty big caveat. I mean, basically replace the Clean Air Act with. Fair enough. I mean, it's a lot of bad regulation. One of my concerns, though, is that unless it's a global price, does it just punish American producers, and especially our mid-size and smaller size producers, at the expense of to the benefit of OPEC, for instance? I think I can make a much stronger argument for countries getting together and putting this sort of what's been talked about, this border adjustment tax on carbon coming from China, since they're the ones who are the primary emitters globally. Almost 30% of global emissions come from just China.
And going up.
And going up, whereas our share keeps decreasing. I think we're at like 11% now.
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
we're at about 11% and going down, and they're at 30% and going up. So, and look, and you're right. There have to be global solutions on these issues. We all are, in the same atmosphere here. The air in China is in California 2 days later. So there have to be global discussions about this. It can't just be one country. But we can show, of course, American leadership. But as we've shown American leadership with the fracking revolution. And I'll note, Europe is going through a terrible energy crisis right now. They've banned fracking on the entire continent. It's not like these resources are unique to the United States. They just happen to be dependent on the resource from Russia and from the United States. We certainly don't want to be in the position that they're in, where they are begging other countries for their resources rather than producing them at home.
Yeah. On another note, back to investment, this popped up in my notes. Comments on this report coming from the New York Fed. It's a couple weeks old, but they reported that climate change just a very, very clear statement, does not pose a risk to financial institutions, to banks. But they did actually say that this path to decarbonization actually pose quite a great risk to financial systems, banking systems, which means your finances. You know what I mean? I think people forget to attach their own livelihoods to some of these bigger institutions. I wish these things weren't attached, but they are. It affects how you get credit. It affects your interest rates. It affects your stocks. It affects your portfolios, your pensions. I'm sorry, but it does. And so these things matter. That was quite the statement. Coming from the New York Fed. I don't know. People just hear New York Fed. They assume it's a bunch of liberals. But apparently it's also a bunch of analysts that just look at the facts.
Yeah, and I do think we need to be very concerned about what the SEC is considering to do, what the Fed is doing as well, and these are big issues. And as I said, there's underinvestment in oil and gas right now, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. So I do wish these conversations were more focused on the analytics, as the New York Fed put forward, not just on emotion. And the analytics suggest more investment, not less investment. Consumers need these products. They need these investments. I will say that I've been very encouraged in your home state of Texas, that Texas just passed a state law last year that says that if you're a investment advisory firm that doesn't invest in fossil fuels or has refused to invest in fossil fuels, that your state pension funds will no longer use those as part of their management of their pension funds. So I do think that there's starting to be pushback at the state level and from, by the way, pensioners who will see lower returns if they're not investing in this important American resource. So there's starting to be pushback at the consumer and at the state level, and that's there does need to be a counterweight here.
Yeah, and that's good to hear. All right, I think I've exhausted a lot of my oil and gas questions, unless you have a lot more to add. I got to ask you about what do you think of John Boehner's book? He came out with a new book recently, kind of a tell-all about his time in Congress. As a lot of people know, it's even funnier if you listen to the audio version. Because just the way he reads, and then kind of goes off script sometimes.
He does.
I mean, what's a story you can tell us that maybe hasn't been heard before? I won't press you. And I don't want to go into this too much.
I worked for John for almost 20 years, starting in his congressional office in 1996 in Hamilton, Ohio. And made it to Washington and eventually became the Speaker's Chief of Staff. So I really lived a charmed Washington life, and I spent 2005 in the Bush White House at the National Economic Council. John is an incredible friend, a great mentor, and I think all of us enjoyed hearing his voice again when he read the book on the House, which is a very appropriately named book for his career, given his humble beginnings in Reading, Ohio. I will say, my favorite parts of the book aren't the parts of the politics side. I lived that, right? I thought the couple of chapters where he talked about those humble upbringings, 11 brothers and sisters with a dad who owned a bar, living in a 2-bedroom house in, really what we would call today poverty. And the fact that guy eventually, made it to the House of Representatives and, was third in line to be the president is an incredible, incredible story. But as you point out, we had a lot of fun along the way too. So it was really the honor of my life to work with him and to serve that great institution in which you now serve.
If people may be curious for some insight, how do you even set yourself up to run for speaker? Is this something that you have to kind of lay the groundwork for years and years and years? Did it sort of come to be? I mean, that's sort of how Paul Ryan had no intention really of running for speaker, and it was sort of thrust upon him in a sense. How was it with John? Was this planned? How did this? I mean, and how do you, as a chief of staff, prep for that?
So let's start at his, those beginnings that we talked about. One of the first things that he did when he got to the House of Representatives in 1992 was expose a lot of the scandal that was going in the House of Representatives at that time. The scandal of the House Bank, where members of Congress could overdraft their accounts. They were literally selling drugs out of the House post office. John was part of a group called the Gang of Seven, which were really the rabble-rousers of the House of Representatives at the time before they took the majority in 1994 in that historic turnover with Newt Gingrich as Speaker. So he was really part of that original group that was a part of the reform revolution that hit the House of Representatives in 1992 to 1994. And, he was an up-and-coming politician, and he was approached many, many different times to run for higher office, whether it was the senator or the governorship of the state of Ohio, and maybe even beyond. He made a decision very early in his career that he wanted to spend his political career in the House of Representatives, and made a decision very early on that if you're going to be there, that the best place to be is in the catbird seat in the speakership. So, and I'll also note that there was a stumble along the way. In 1998, when House Republicans lost a significant number of seats, he got tossed from the House Republican leadership. He was at that point the number 4 ranking official as conference chair, and he worked his way back by working hard and taking on the Education and Workforce Committee, and then eventually advancing to the speakership. I will say I do think it was very deliberate. I think a lot of people thought that he was going to leave after 1998 and think about what he was going to do with the rest of his life, but he wanted to be Speaker of the House. And he planned accordingly and laid the groundwork for that all along the way. But it really is also a story of resilience and coming back from a setback and never giving up.
Yeah, it's a lot of drama up here, though. I'm almost surprised at people who want to be Speaker of the House.
I reflect back on our time, and John was Speaker for 5 years, and then obviously left in a dramatic fashion as well. But you think about the fact that he was Speaker for 5 years in this really, really challenging, difficult era. Paul only lasted, 3 years, for example, as Speaker. It's just a really difficult time to govern. And I do think, when I came up in politics, at least on the right, it was you worried about talk radio, you worried about the Wall Street Journal editorial page and National Review, and that was about it. There are so many disparate voices now, and every member can, have their own podcast, can, participate on social media. So this is a difficult, era, I think, to govern. And, I think I admire you for stepping up to the plate and running for Congress and continuing to serve your country, because this really is a time when we need the best people in America stepping up and putting their name on the line and being willing to serve. Yeah.
And it's an interesting analysis of the media, because I think because it's become so much more horizontal and so disparate that you don't have these bulwarks of truth telling, which I would call the Wall Street Journal and I would call National Review. I certainly wouldn't call all talk show hosts that. And in fact, I think many have probably but you had Rush Limbaugh for years and years and years. You had like this guy to go to. and his conservative and his other wannabe Rush Limbaughs try to compete with that. They try to be provocative. They will lie to you. They're grifters. I mean, a lot of them. I got a lot of trouble recently for this comment, but I wasn't really referring to the Freedom Caucus at all. Actually, that was kind of mischaracterized. I was referring to a segment of Republicans, so-called conservatives, that are really just there to monetize outrage. That's the only reason they exist. And they know that they can get a lot more clicks and a lot more money, a lot more viewers if they just go after Republicans. They know that's what gets us riled up as voters, because we're always nervous about somebody betraying us. It's almost like part of the conservative DNA. And they tap into that psychology and they manipulate people. And it's frankly disgusting. They're grifters, and I want people to watch out for it. And what I say all the time is, look, here's a couple telltale signs that they're about to lie to you. First, they say, you come here to my show for the truth. I tell you how it is. I don't have an agenda. I just want to tell you the truth. That's why you listen to my show. Does that sound familiar? They're about to lie to you when they're saying that. And when they use words like rhino and establishment and, neocon, they're about to lie to you, right? When they resort to these dumb names. And I'm sure John Boehner would agree, by the way. So anyway, you don't have to respond to that, but it's true, man. There are grifters in our midst, and for the record, I wasn't really talking about my own colleagues, but in any case. I am talking about a lot of other people. And frankly, it's all the people that reacted badly to that, because the Freedom Caucus didn't even react to it because they know I'm not talking about them. But the people who did react to it are exactly who I'm talking about. So I'll leave it at that. Mike, thanks for being on, man. Appreciate it. Thanks for talking to us about the important oil and gas industry and your experiences there.
Let's do it again.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks so much.
Bye.